Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, November 5th. The Ohio State Buckeyes are the number one team still in the nation in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Committee. You love to see it. And I'm joined by our deputy editor at 11 Warriors, who was in the media scrum after the rankings were released to get some additional details on what the committee thought relative to Ohio State versus Indiana as the number one team, Mr. Dan Hope. Dan, how was your evening Tuesday night as the rankings dropped?
It's that time of year, I guess. We're getting close. We're only about a month away from the end of the season and the college football playoff being a real thing. So, it comes up fast. It's hard to believe we're already at that point of the year, already November, already in the true home stretch with just 4 weeks left of regular season. And as such, it means college football playoff discourse is in full swing.
Yeah, I have to say, it's Ryan Day was asked about it, I believe, yesterday too. He said, "quote whatever" in regards to these not official rankings. Obviously, the only rankings that matter are the ones that come out after conference championship week. So these are obviously just a bit of a talking point, a temperature taking, if you will, of what the committee is thinking about the teams. But that being said, does give us something to talk about. And certainly, if Indiana had been ranked number one, you know that there are a bunch of Ohio State fans that would have had something to say about it. But thankfully, the Buckeyes are recognized as number one. We'll get into what that means relative to what we were expecting and. As the rankings are set right now, who Ohio State could potentially be seeing in the playoff if we get a similar set down the home stretch of the season here. But before we get into that, we do want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They're locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Now, Dan, you in your Big Ten power rankings have been championing Indiana for a handful of weeks now in terms of them having the better resume than Ohio State. There were more than a few people, I think, that were trying to slight Indiana having the better win on the resume than anything Ohio State has relative to Oregon. I will say these latest edition of the rankings, Washington had been a team that had kind of been disrespected all season by the AP and the coaches polls, and they did crack the top 25 in the CFP rankings. Texas has obviously had a bit of a resurgence of late. They got the win over Vandy, who was a top 10 team last week, and now that win is starting to, after depreciating heavily in value over the first half of the season, is starting to recover a bit of stock for Ohio State. So perhaps those two surges in ranking have assisted Ohio State's profile a little bit. That being said, the committee did come out after this and said that there was a healthy amount of discussion between the members on it in terms of what teams should be number one at this stage, given the resume of the two teams. And even in acknowledging the fact that these two teams are inevitably going to play in the Big Ten championship, assuming they win out. So there will be a decision to be made. It was still recognized that Ohio State, the defending national champion, should be number one at this juncture, having not lost this season. So I'm curious, given where you were anointing Indiana in your own Big Ten power rankings and what was addressed to you and the rest of the media in wake of the rankings release, do you agree with the decision? Are you content with it?
I mean, personally, I still think Indiana should be number one. I mean,
Oh,
that's
blasphemous.
my opinion. I think Indiana has a better win than Ohio State going on the road, beat Oregon. I mean, but you talk about teams that are surging up the rankings. Another team that I think was being disrespected in the polls but is getting more respect in the CFP rankings is Iowa. Now we'll get a better gauge of how good Iowa really is this week when it plays Oregon. But I think Iowa, in my mind, I have them as the fourth best team in the Big Ten right now. They're behind USC right now by one spot and one spot ahead of Michigan in these CFP rankings. But, I think the way Iowa's played, I think that was maybe one of the things that's maybe been held against Indiana in that discussion is like, oh, they only beat Iowa by 5 points. Kinnick's a tough place to play, and Iowa's been playing good football. So we'll see how they do against Oregon this week. But to me, I think Indiana having you got a road win at Oregon, a road win at Iowa, demolishing Illinois. To me, I still think just on a resume perspective, Indiana has the best resume. They have the best margin of victory. They've got the top scoring offense in the country right now, in addition to a top 3 defense. So in my opinion, I still, if it was me, I would still have Indiana at number 1. That being said, when Mac Rhodes was asked about it, there were a few things that he cited in terms of why Ohio State came out at number 1. He said that the committee felt that Ohio State has the better defense. They felt that Ohio State is the better offensive line. And, he also mentioned on the teleconference the explosive players that Ohio State has. Didn't specify, but I think certainly Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate come to mind. He cited all 3 of those things in terms of why the committee felt Ohio State was the best team, which again, it's one of those things that kind of comes down to that like best team versus best resume, right? Like I do think Ohio State is the best team. I would pick Ohio State to beat Indiana right now. Ohio State would be my pick to win the national championship right now. As you said, this is really at this juncture, it's really all a made for TV discussion. If both these teams win out, they will play each other in Indianapolis, and the winner of that game is almost certainly going to be the number 1 seed if they both win out the rest of the way. So the good news for both Ohio State and Indiana is, they control their own destiny, basically. I mean, I suppose it's possible, that, Texas A&M wins out and the committee could vault them up to number 1 if they're undefeated. But it certainly feels like Ohio State and Indiana, by virtue of being the number 1 and number 2 teams, and the fact that they would play each other in the Big Ten championship game, that both of them basically control their own destiny in terms of potentially being the number 1 seed in the college football playoff. And so this will ultimately play itself out on the field. But, right now the committee agrees with, the AP poll, the coaches poll, Ohio State being the number 1 team in the country. I think the interesting thing that he brought up, that I'm not even really sure that all Ohio State fans necessarily agree with, was the point of Ohio State having the better offensive line. I
That
think,
was what I was going to
yeah,
ask you about next. Was do you agree with the committee's assessment and that being like a talking point to put Ohio State over Indiana? Not
yeah,
that I'm an expert on the Hoosiers in the trenches or anything in terms of appraising those two, but I did think that was interesting
yeah.
myself.
I'm not gonna say that I necessarily think that he's wrong. Like it's hard to say on that. Like I think it's like physically, Ohio State's offensive line is probably like the physically on paper better offensive line. I do think that, though. I mean, if you're going to compare these teams, like and if you're looking for an area where Indiana's been better, Indiana's been definitely better running the ball than Ohio State has. We also saw Ohio State have a pretty shaky game in pass protection this past week against Penn State, and so I'm not. I wouldn't necessarily say I think Indiana's offensive line is better than Ohio State's necessarily, but that wouldn't be the point that I would use as an argument in favor of Ohio State. I think the defense argument is valid, though. Again, I think Indiana's defense is really, really good too. Like I think Ohio State's defense is clearly the best in the country right now, so I think that's a valid point. But I don't think there's like a huge chasm between Ohio State's defense and Indiana's defense. I think the explosive players point is a valid one too. Now, again, Indiana has explosive players of its own. I mean, I think you're talking about the 2 best quarterbacks in the country right now in Julian Saint at Ohio State, Fernando Mendoza at Indiana. We've already talked about that possibility that the Big Ten championship game could decide the Heisman Trophy. Indiana's up there in terms of best receiving tandems in the country too. If Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr., they've both been fantastic this year. But if you're putting them side by side, I mean, no team side by side is as good as Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate there. So I think the defense and explosive players argument, to me, those carry more weight right now than the offensive line argument, because I think Ohio State's offensive line still has a lot to prove over the next month.
Yeah, I was I thought that in terms of if you were going to make an argument for Ohio State over Indiana, it would have been better served to really hammer home how historically great the defense has been relative to the rest of college football, as opposed to trying to find a variety of reasons why Ohio State should be number one. Because I do agree that I would be very curious to see what Kurt Signetti thinks of the media's appraisal that Ohio State's offensive line has been better than Indiana's. I'm sure he would have some colorful insight on that. And yeah, I do. It's there is a bit of a chasm in terms of I think the skip, but chasm might even be an extreme word. There's not a very I want to be careful how I say this because obviously the Tate Smith duo is clearly the best in college football, but I do think that it's not as much of a pronounced gap based on the production we've seen as maybe you would be led to believe if you were a massive Ohio State homer between Indiana's receivers. I will say if Indiana had been the number one team tonight, I would have worn the Waffle House hat out of respect for Elijah Surratt, but unfortunately I shouldn't say unfortunately. I'm happy Ohio State is still number one, obviously, but I never miss an opportunity to wear to represent Waffle House on this show. In any event, Ohio State's number one. They did rank all the other top 25 teams. So taking a look at what the matchups would be right now, Indiana was obviously number two. Texas A&M was number three. That was largely what was expected. There wasn't necessarily much of a shakeup there. I did think it was interesting. Joey Galloway did make a case for Texas A&M being one of the top two teams at least, which I thought was interesting coming from a representative of the Ohio State media, or a representative of Ohio State in the media, I should say. That being said, Alabama was number four. Georgia was fifth, so the SEC did get three of the top five teams, followed by another SEC team in Ole Miss at number six, BYU number seven, Texas Tech rather got the number eight spot. Can you imagine telling the fans of college football in Texas at the beginning of the season that A&M wouldn't be projected in the first CFP rankings, but A&M and Texas Tech would both be projected to make it? It's crazy how much this sport is shaken up just in the first 2 months of the season. But Oregon is number nine, Notre Dame number 10, Virginia 11th, and Memphis. The Memphis Tigers are currently number 12th, projected to play Georgia. Ohio State, based on those current rankings, would play one of either Texas Tech or Oregon for what would be a rematch in the Rose Bowl. What I want to ask you, Dan, is would you be interested? Would you be more interested in seeing Ohio State rematch one of the teams that it played in the CFP last season, assuming it gets it the first round bye, and they're only going to end up playing 3 games in the CFP? Would you be more interested in seeing them rematch teams that they played last season, or would you rather see them play fresh teams? I'm of the mind that I would rather see them play new teams, but I'm curious where your excitement lies relative to those two options.
Yeah, I think an Ohio State Oregon game could be fun, especially considering that they're not going to play during the regular season. I don't really think there's much of a scenario in which they would play. I mean, I guess if Indiana lost twice, they could play in the Big Ten championship game, but very unlikely that Ohio State Oregon would meet in the Big Ten championship game. So our only chance to see those two teams play would be in the college football playoff. And so to me, I think Oregon this year is a different team than Oregon last year. Same thing with Ohio State. And I mean, obviously, I don't think a lot of Ohio State fans would be too upset by the idea of an Ohio State Oregon Rose Bowl based on the way last year's game went. But to me, it's like sometimes it's like, do you want to see teams rematch that already played during the season? Like, I think I'd rather, if you were going to ask me like Ohio State and Texas playing again, Texas, Texas is not out of this thing yet. As you mentioned, they're not in the field right now, but they are ranked 11th. Just those last two spots going to Virginia and Memphis right now because the ACC group of five would get those last two spots. But Texas still in this thing, so it's not out of a question. We could see an Ohio State Texas rematch. I'd probably be more inclined to want to see Ohio State play different teams than they already played during the regular season. But I think an Ohio State Oregon matchup would be a lot of fun since we're not going to see it before the college football playoff.
Yeah, I personally would rather see them play a team like, and even though these are two teams that they played recently, just not ones they played recently as Oregon, I would rather see them play teams like Alabama or Georgia, that they could potentially get one back on in terms of teams that they recently lost to in the college football playoff. Even a fresh team like Ole Miss. I mean, we love to see Ohio State take the opportunity to embarrass Lane Kiffin. So I certainly wouldn't shake a stick at that. Even BYU, I think, could be potentially interesting. And who's to say? I mean, it would be assuming Ohio State and Indiana do end up meeting in the Big Ten championship, and Ohio State were to prevail in that. It would be interesting to see where the committee would end up ranking Indiana, how far they would fall relative to their seeding, if they would end up on the same side of the bracket as Ohio State would be number one, or if they would slot them, they would have to fall as low as 6, I think. And in that point, do you potentially rank them as a team? Or I'm not sure if they would still qualify for one of the top 4 seeds, but
I
you
mean, if
wonder.
are you saying if Ohio State, Indiana both go 12-0 and play in the Big Ten championship game? I think they'll both be in the top 4.
Okay.
I'd be shocked if they both go 12-0. I'd be shocked if they're not both in the top 4
Well,
because
even in that event, they would have to only drop one spot, which, depending on how close the
well, I think the
championship is,
thing
you would
I
think they
look
would.
at here would say, if you look at it right now, you mentioned it, the top 6 teams right now are all in the Big Ten or the SEC. I mean, if you go down further, you've got 9 of the top 12 are in the Big Ten and the SEC. So I think it's very possible the top 4 are going to still, even with conference championship games factored in, could still end up being 2 Big Ten, 2 SEC. You would think in that case they'd probably want to make it work so that you don't have the Big Ten and SEC teams on the same side. You'd think they'd probably want to make it work. So, like, okay, Ohio State's 1, SEC champ 2, Indiana 3, as SEC runner up 4. You would think. Now, that's not guaranteed. I mean, I think probably the team that has the probably the teams that have the most best chance of breaking that up would be whoever wins BYU Texas Tech this weekend, because they're 7-8. I mean, particularly if BYU runs the table, you would think they would have a strong case for a top 4 seed. But, if I was just playing the odds right now, I'd probably say that the Big Ten and SEC are going to end up each having 2 teams in the top 4 seats.
And I would think too that they would want to set it up to where there could be a potential rematch in the national championship between Ohio State and Indiana, which is why I bring that up and why I wouldn't, if I have to see Ohio State play a team that it's already played recently, I would rather see that on a national championship setting than as opposed to on its road to the college football playoff. If it was a little bit different last year when I wanted them to get one back on Oregon and they did it. Maybe I'll feel differently if Indiana does win in the Big Ten championship and Ohio State isn't the number 1 seed, but heaven forbid that happens, and we're still a month away from it. So yeah, good overall. I think the rankings I think they got it right. I know we have a bit of a disagreement on that, but I certainly I wouldn't have called it an injustice if Indiana had gotten the number 1 seed. I think they had a decent argument. I think that it was good that the committee acknowledged that there was some discussion on it, even if I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with all of their logic for doing so. I think that there were enough pieces there to make the case for Ohio State. So yeah, we've got another chance for Ohio State to prove itself as the number 1 team this coming weekend, when they make the road trip to where they always love to go, West Lafayette. And we're going to be back on Friday to break down that game. Although I didn't tell Dan this before the show, but Dan's actually not going to be the one to break the game down with us on Friday. So this is all the Dan Hope you're getting this week. But we do appreciate Dan jumping on with us right after he just got out of the CFP media scrum. So, Dan, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. Thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. We will be back tomorrow with Andy Anders to talk about Ohio State football, or potentially some observations on how the debut for Ohio State basketball went in a game that had over 200 points scored. So I'm sure that he certainly has some feelings and observations to get out about what went on with the regular season debut for Ohio State basketball. But cross that bridge when we come to it. In the meantime, Dan, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow. Take care, folks.